Hello everyone, I am Cristobal, this is Daniel, and today we're going to talk about how EVs and how demand response can help improve the operation of the electricity grid in Chile. So over the past few months, we've been engaging with regulators and with charging operators in the country to understand how we can help do this via demand response. So what is demand response? As you may know, whenever you consume electricity in your house, there needs to be a generation asset at some point in the network that is producing that electricity at that exact time. So electric supply needs to be equal to electric demand at every point in time. However, sometimes there are imbalances. So for example, a power plant may stop working, or maybe a day is warmer than expected, so everyone is turning on their ACs, so demand is higher than expected. And we need to fix these imbalances if we want to avoid having blackouts in the grid. So what we usually do is we resort to either gas peaker plants, which are resources that can be turned on really fast, or to battery storage to increase that supply and meet that demand. However, demand can also play a role, and this is where demand response comes in. We can, for example, as consumers, get paid by charging our EV at a different time, or set up our thermostats a few degrees higher for a few hours to help bring demand down and eliminate this difference between supply and demand. Now, I was just mentioning that batteries and gas peaker plants can also achieve this, but we believe demand response needs to play a central role in Latin America. First of all, because it is 50% cheaper than these alternatives. Second, because if it's done right, it can be more sustainable because you don't require a physical asset and because you can help displace fossil fuel peaker plants. Third, because it incentivizes electrification. It provides a revenue stream for both consumers and companies to monetize their assets that consume electricity. And finally, because it's a very reliable source of flexibility. We also think that EVs will be central in demand response. First of all, because they're growing super fast, not only in the US, but also in Latin America, driven by very ambitious policies and targets, particularly in Chile. Second, because they have a very high power requirement. Whenever you plug in an EV in your house, it triples the demand that you have for your total house. So this can either become a liability for the grid in the future, or it can help alleviate this strain if we manage it appropriately. Third, if we do it in a smart way and we take into account the user preferences, it can have no negative impact in the consumer. And finally, it's a very fast and responsive asset. You can manage it remotely, it can respond in seconds, which are very important characteristics to help alleviate these gaps in the grid.
Chile is one of the most market-forward, private sector-forward countries for power systems, so that makes it easy to create business models in the area. Second, there's a lot of renewable power inside the country, but there's one issue, which is the grid essentially congested. The pipelines, if you will, to get power from where renewable power from where it is to where it's needed are clogged. We call that curtailment. The renewable power essentially needs to stop while the congestion is dealt with. So here we have a map of some of the key bottlenecks that are building up, and by 2026 we expect 30% to 40% of renewables to be curtailed in those regions. Third, there's a figure that we call large energy users in Chile. The regulation that applies to them is a little more lenient and allows us more flexibility to apply a demand response-esque model. And fourth, we see a lot of bus fleet electric growth, and we'll get more into that. That's a big opportunity. There are a couple of regulatory issues, though. First, at a very fundamental level, the way the system is set up is not built for demand response. And not only does it not fit, but also there's just no figures for us to monetize, to get paid for those activities. And we'll get more into that in a few. And now double-clicking on those electric vehicles we've been talking about, there's good news. First of all, at the bus levels, we're seeing there's currently a huge fleet. Chile has the second largest electric bus fleet in the world, second only to China, and it's only growing. Over the past 3 years, there's been 3 procurement processes to get more and more stations, more and more buses. This keeps growing. It won't stop, especially in Santiago, the capital city. EVs are currently very small. We're talking about only a couple thousand that have been bought so far, but we expect growth to be huge, especially as Cristobal mentioned, there's a policy by 2035. The government has decreed all new vehicles must be all zero emission. Some of those might be hydrogen just because of other policies the government might set up, but we're quite bullish on what that can be.
And as Danny was mentioning, today we see the main opportunity in the public bus fleet. We have 17 megawatts of power demand in the public bus sector. The privately owned EV sector is still small in Chile, but we expect this to evolve significantly over the next decade as we approach the timeline for the Chilean targets. In fact, if this plays out and we're able to meet those targets, this would mean that EV charging would represent around 15% of the total peak power demand nationwide, which ultimately means that the opportunity for demand response via EV charging is immense.
Now, so that's the essential market impact. Let's talk a little bit about the environmental impact, and let's walk through the chart on the left. So let's start with that orange line. That is our model of what the demand for an electric bus fleet can look like. At night, you're really not charging much more. In the morning and the day goes by, you're charging in and out. The night comes in, you charge all your buses, get them ready for the next day. That's kind of how what it looks like. The blue bars are the average emissions in the Chilean grid for every given hour. So we were thinking about this and saying, well, what happens when you put in demand response? What's really going to happen at the end of the day is for any given hour you take demand from, you're going to have to put it somewhere else. You're not going to destroy that demand, it simply shifts. So if you shift to an hour with greater emissions, you're going to have more emissions. If you shift to one with less, you're going to reduce them. We looked at two scenarios to simplify things. This red one is essentially this easier one where you tell a fleet operator at their peak demand time here at 7 p.m., you tell them, well, just procrastinate your charging by 1 hour. Do that every day. If you do that, you actually end up increasing the yearly emissions by that, the amount in the red circle. If you instead find a way to make them move the demand towards noon or valley demand, valley emission time, you reduce emissions by that amount. So our conclusion here is you need to be careful how you design a demand response scheme in order to have a different emission effect. And a final, even more nuanced note is, at the end of the day, regardless of which of these two scenarios you're in, you're enabling renewable generation at the larger scale. So it's a very nuanced take on how it can happen, but the maximum positive effect is if you're very careful. Now let's talk about how we can actually fit into the Chilean framework, how we can actually monetize and get demand response working. We see kind of three categories of ways we can do it. Two that are currently available are fairly small. There's just not a lot of monetization available. They're what we call off-market and peak shaving strategies. What they mean is taking what are called power purchase agreements and modifying them to fit the demand response scheme. These are currently available. You really don't need to change much. You just need to change contracts that are out there. There's not much money there though. The next three, ancillary services, capacity and energy, these are the standard products that are traded in most energy markets. The thing is, how they're currently traded in the Chilean market do not allow people that would do demand response to play in them. So that would require significant regulatory reform. Similar for distribution and alleviation, this is helping reduce the constraints at the distribution level, like at the capillaries of the system. That's even harder. That requires more schemes from distributors in particular. And lastly, to close out, we want to talk about what could be next at the end of the day, and kind of focusing on the people we've been talking to. So in this research, we spoke with Voltex, an operator for bus fleet back in Chile. They're excited. They would love to do demand response. They have the means and the will to do it, but they're afraid of the regulatory scheme and how they could navigate that. We also talked to regulators, and while they see the opportunity, they don't quite understand how to fit in the system, the pieces, and what would be important to whoever would actually do it. And there's really no entrepreneurs out there doing the work. All these parties need to communicate what is needed for the scheme to work in the long term. And ultimately, that's why we're building the white paper that we're building, and we're going to be sharing it with all these players. We're hoping this will help unlock a demand response in the long term. We realize it'll take time and the opportunity isn't immediately available, but we're quite excited about it regardless. That's all for us.
You started the presentation suggesting that this is a very reliable supply of electricity. Have you checked the empirical evidence in the United States or other places that have such demand management programs in order to see the degree of reliability, in fact, that they have? And then the follow-up is, how are you going to move to assure reliability?
When we talk about reliability, an important aspect that we were thinking about is your ability to modify that demand as you required. So, for example, one issue with gas power plants is that it is a physical asset that has a certain capacity, while demand response is a resource that you can expand and reduce or move it to a different location if you don't require it anymore or a certain region. So that flexibility is something that is very attractive for the system. What we have seen in the US, for example, here in California, in the event that we had, I believe it was 2021 in the winter, where there was a grid emergency. We saw some companies like OmConnect, for example, that had a lot of customers in their network, and they were able to leverage some of that flexibility of those customers to help alleviate some of that emergency. But there's definitely opportunity to advance further and ensure that those customers are appropriately compensated and that they are there when they are needed. Ensure that it's not just a promise, okay, we're going to deliver these megawatts, but those megawatts are delivered and those consumers are compensated appropriately.
I think you probably should check into the empirical evidence of how well it works in practice. Now, not for big crises like 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 you've referred to, but in a normal operating. If you decide to go ahead in this project.
Thanks. Definitely cannot expect 100% reliability. People sometimes just need to keep the lights on in their business and their homes. We would hope scale would help, but certainly it's a risk whenever you're going to apply this.
You mentioned in Chile that there is a need to increasingly curtail a lot of the renewables on the grid, mostly due to congested transmission. Is there also an oversupply of renewables, or would they benefit from having just an increased grid system?
There's no oversupply. It's 100% a transmission issue. It's because most of the solar resource and wind resource is in the north, and then that has grown so fast that we haven't been able to grow the transmission line fast enough. But there's still a lot of space to keep growing solar and wind if we had enough transmission.
If you look at the geometry of it, it's very hard to justify redundant networks, like a transmission lines that would be parallel. So it's very hard to travel all that distance when there's just no demand up in the north.
I see. Are there plans to expand the network in the near term?
Yes, but they don't move as fast as they would if you could say you could also serve a user.
I see. Okay, great presentation, thank you.